Welcome to the EPG Pathshala Linguistics course. I'm Prabal Dasgupta from the Indian Statistical Institute, Kolkata. We shall now be covering a module about mobile subjects and objects. In this module, the objective is to consider those transformations in which certain elements move out of subject positions into other subject and object positions, and where certain elements move out of object positions. In order to introduce the subject matter of this module, it is best to begin from the side by introducing another transformation which serves as a very useful diagnostic for the things that we wish to talk about. That other transformation is exemplified in sentences 1 and 2. 1 is some children were in the room, and 2 is there were some children in the room. The transformation responsible for this alternation is known as their insertion. Right now, we are not going to try to state that transformation carefully. We will come back to that problem later in this module. For the time being, we want you to concentrate on the fact that that process exists. This transformation interacts with other processes, including the one we are about to take up for study. Consider the sentence, Rahim seems to like ice cream, and compare it with the sentence, it seems that Rahim likes ice cream. The structure of the sentence is much clearer when you say it seems that Rahim likes ice cream. Why? In that sentence, it is clear that the clause Rahim likes ice cream is under discussion, and that you're being told that this is the impression one gets. It seems, that is to say, we get the impression that Rahim likes ice cream. That is really the meaning of the sentence. It remains the meaning of the sentence when you go into the infinitive and say to like ice cream rather than likes ice cream. However, in the infinitive, you don't say it seems Rahim to like ice cream. Instead, you say Rahim seems to like ice cream. We conclude that the deep structure is really blank seems Rahim to like ice cream with a blank subject upstairs. Rahim goes to that blank position, vacating its downstairs subject position. It goes upstairs. And the resulting structure is Rahim seems blank to like ice cream. From this point onwards, when our deep structure postulates a blank of this kind, a position that remains empty for something to fill afterwards, we use a piece of notation to say so. We shall show that blank in the deep structure with the Greek letter capital delta, which looks like a very small triangle. Delta stands for the sound D, which is the first sound of the word dummy. This delta is a dummy, it's a placeholder that waits for the actual subject to arrive. Now you will see how there is interaction between this process, which raises a subject from a downstairs subject position to an upstairs subject position, with the their insertion process we mentioned earlier. Consider the surface structure. There seem to be some children in the room. We have reason to believe that that sentence starts out in the form of the deep structure. Delta seems some children to be in the room. After which, in the embedded or downstairs sentence, their insertion applies, giving you the intermediate structure, delta seem there to be some children in the room. Then that there, which has become this subject of the downstairs sentence because of the application of their insertion, there moves up from the downstairs subject position to the upstairs subject position, giving you the final output, there seem to be some children in the room. There, mind you, is a pleonastic or expletive subject. It is not a meaningful word. It is a word that serves as a kind of placeholder that is introduced by the transformation called their insertion. It is similar to the element 8, which is introduced by extraposition that I told you about in the preceding module. There seems to be raising also in Hindi, Urdu, and in Bangla. When you take a sentence like Hindi, Urdu, 8 bacche chillane lage, there is reason to believe that lage is a raising trigger. It is a verb that triggers the operation of raising to subject. That 8 bacche starts out as the subject of the embedded clause, the subordinate clause, 8 bacche chillane, and it comes out of that position and is raised to the upstairs or matrix subject position, where it becomes the subject of lage, which is why lage shows plural agreement with 8 bacche instead of being laga. We assume that the Bangla sentence 8 baccha chanchate laglo, which is identical to the Hindi Urdu sentence 8 bacche chillane lage, behaves pretty much in the same way. So we have given you an exercise requesting you to draw the surface structure tree for the Hindi sentence. It is less clear whether an operation similar to their insertion applies in Bangla and in Hindi Urdu, but there is prima facie evidence that perhaps such an operation does in fact apply. We therefore have an alternation between the Hindi sentence 8 bacche kamre mein the and the corresponding Bangla sentence 8 baccha ghore chilo, meaning 8 children were in the room, and what appears to be a their insertion variant, which comes out in Hindi as kamre mein 8 bacche the and in Bangla as ghore 8 baccha chilo, literally in the room 8 children were, which has the same properties as English their insertion sentences, such as there were 8 children in the room. We therefore presume that perhaps there is an invisible or volatile pleonastic element in the initial position of kamre mein 8 bacche the, which is Hindi for in the room 8 children were, and in the Bangla sentence ghore 8 baccha chilo, which is a counterpart to that Hindi Urdu sentence. We cannot, however, guarantee that this is a sustainable account of the sentences we are considering. What we can tell you is that when you try to state their insertion for English, you need to link it to the verb be, and that when you try to say raising to subject for English, you need to link it to a class of verbs and adjectives which trigger the application of raising to subject. The matter does not depend on meaning, the matter depends on lexical properties. Particular words trigger the application of this rule, whereas other words which have the same meaning do not trigger it. For example, the adjective likely and its antonym unlikely trigger raising to subject. You get these children are likely to want ice cream, or these children are unlikely to want ice cream. But the synonym of likely, probable, does not trigger raising to subject. So you cannot say these children are probable to want ice cream. You also cannot say these children are improbable to want ice cream. These sentences are quite bad. The verb seem also triggers the process, as we have illustrated earlier. These children seem to like ice cream. So when you state their insertion, your statement of the rule has to mention the verb be. We tentatively state it by saying that the structural description says noun phrase auxiliary be X, and that the 1, 2, 3, 4 in the structural change turns into there 2, 3, 4 plus 1. So 1 gets shifted to the right and is attached to 4, which is a variable x. Remember that attachment to a variable means that you become a daughter of the sentence. And in place of 1, you get there inserted. That is their insertion. Notice that it mentions B. Just as their insertion mentions B, raising to subject mentions the triggering element. We showed the triggering element by using a feature plus raising. So, our analysis for 15, raising to subject, says structural description. Noun phrase, auxiliary, variable, plus raising item, variable. A noun phrase at the beginning of a sentence, we show that by showing a labeled bracket with the S label on the left bracket, followed by the auxiliary to, not the preposition to, that's why we mark it as an auxiliary, followed by another variable. That gives you 8 factors. Of these 8 factors, the 6th factor, the NP, which is the downstairs subject, becomes the first factor. It goes to the position of the first factor, and that's all that happens. So 1 through 8 turns into 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 0, 7, 8. Since no copy is left of the raised subject, it completely vacates the downstairs position. Why did we write raising as the feature for that raising trigger rather than raising to subject? Because there is another kind of raising which also involves the same special feature. It's called raising to object. If you compare the sentence, Dilip expects that Zarif will win, where the embedded sentence Zarif will win is finite, by which we mean that its auxiliary will carries tense. If you compare this sentence with Dilip expects Zarif to win, there is reason to believe that these have the same deep structure, and that therefore Dilip expects Zarif to win at the level of deep structure treats Zarif as the subject of the downstairs verb win. As you can see, if it moves upstairs, the only place it can go is the position of the object of expect. In order for it to be able to go to that position, there has to be in the deep structure a place waiting for it to come and occupy the place. You need a placeholder. So we arrange for there to be a Greek capital delta, a dummy, in the object position of expects. In the deep structure, Dilip expects delta Zarif to win. The result of applying raising to object is to raise the downstairs subject to the upstairs object position, yielding the structure 17, where Dilip expects Zarif is outside the brackets of the downstairs sentence, and only to win appears within those brackets. How do you know that this is happening? How do you know that Zarif is moving from the downstairs subject to the upstairs object position, given that you can only see on the surface that it appears between expect and to? The answer can be gleaned from the data of the sentence, Dilip expects there to be children in the room, where we can show that there comes in by the operation of their insertion in the downstairs clause. Dilip expects followed by the downstairs clause, there to be children in the room, and then there is raised to object, after which you can apply passivization and say there are expected to be children in the room. The fact that raising to object feeds passivization, and that even an expletive element like there can undergo this process, shows that it's a robust syntactic process, and that we have empirical evidence for it. We can now perform a formal statement for raising to object. We provide it at 22. We need 7 factors here. Auxiliary is the second factor, preceded by a variable, followed by the raising trigger, and then your delta appears. Then you have the crucial downstairs subject waiting to move, followed by the infinitival to, which is one of the stimuli that you need for the transformation to apply, finally followed by a variable factor. There are 7 factors in all. The 5th factor is the mobile subject, and it goes from the position of the 5th factor to the position of the 4th factor, because it moves not to the upstairs subject but to the upstairs object position, which is not at the very beginning of the entire analysis. We have called this module Mobile Subjects and Objects. You might be puzzled because so far we have only talked about mobile subjects. You might be wondering when we are going to get around to mobile objects. This is the time to talk about mobile objects. On the way to mobile objects, we want to quickly show you a set of restricted raising to object operations which look like raising to object but which are done with a different class of triggering verbs. After that, we'll take you to objects that actually move out. Let us finish with raising to subject and object from subject position before we look at mobile objects. If the downstairs clause does not have a true infinitival with an auxiliary to, but a naked infinitival, as it is called, where the verb is left naked with no auxiliary protecting it, you get sentences like, Sharmila saw him break the cup, or we have never heard her sing this song. Notice that you're not saying Sharmila saw him to break the cup. Notice that you're not saying we have never heard her to sing this song. There is no to here. That's why these are called naked infinitives. Sharmila saw him break the cup and we have never heard her sing this song. Nobody will make you visit him against your will. These are examples of restricted raising. Now, what is interesting is that if these are cases of raising to object, you would expect passivization to be possible. But most of the time, passivization is not allowed. You cannot say he was seen break the cup. You cannot say she was never heard sing this song, which is a bit strange. Even stranger is the fact that you can passivize when the triggering verb is make, but then you get a very strange side effect. You get the sentence, you will not be made to visit him against your will. Notice that the to suddenly appears in the passive. In the passive, you get, you will not be made to visit him against your will. You can't say it without the word to. You can't say you will not be made visit him against your will. But in the active, one says, we will not make you visit him against your will without the word to. So there is something really strange happening. People don't have a really high quality analysis of these strange phenomena. For the moment, we classify them as restricted raising facts, and we return to the topic in connection with some Indian language data that seem to be somewhat similar. A few more topics later. First, we want to talk about mobile objects. Before that, we just wanted to completely clear the ground of mobile subjects. That is why we have done restricted raising first. Mobile objects appear in sentences like, it is tough to please John, the input to the process, and the output of the process is John is tough to please. As you see, John is the object of to please John and becomes the subject of the sentence, John is tough to please. This process is triggered by words like tough. It is therefore called tough movement. It is triggered by adjectives like tough and easy and impossible and difficult and hard and so on. So you get John is easy to please, John is hard to please, John is difficult to please, John is impossible to please. There is a formal statement we provide at item 31 in our e-text. I don't want to go over it with you because it looks exactly like the formal statements of the raising processes we have done so far. What you will find interesting is exercise 4 in which we ask you to think about the input to tough movement. Recall that the input for tough movement is a sentence like, "It is tough to please John." We ask you to think about that input sentence and to notice that it cannot possibly be a deep structure. Why are we saying "it is tough to please John" cannot possibly be a deep structure? Because, as we say in the exercise, it contains a pleonastic element inserted by a transformation that is applied earlier in the derivation. What we ask you to do is find the pleonastic element and identify the rule which has inserted it. We are not giving away a secret by telling you that the pleonastic element and the transformation have both been mentioned in our oral exposition, though not in this module. We now turn to some Indian language data which look like a very close cousin of the restricted raising data we gave you. You need to compare Sharmila saw him break the cup, which has a naked infinitive, with Sharmila saw him breaking the cup, which has a participle. When you get a participle instead of a naked infinitive, you can routinely passivize in English. So you get, he was seen breaking the cup, she was heard singing the song, etc., etc. The class of triggers is a bit different. Make, for example, doesn't trigger restricted raising when there's a participle. The reason we want you to look at this is that there are similar sentences in Hindi, Urdu, and in Bangla. So in Hindi, Urdu, you get sentences like, "हमने कल सुबह राम और श्याम को दौड़ते हुए देखा." We saw Ram and Shyam running yesterday morning. When you look at Bangla, things are a bit harder. In Hindi, Urdu, you can tell for sure that "daurte hue" is indeed a participle. In Bangla, "dourote" in the sentence "Amra kal shokale Ram ar Shyam ke dourote dekhechi," we saw Ram and Shyam running yesterday morning. We can't tell whether "dourote" in Bangla counts here as an infinitival or as a participle. You see, the problem is Bangla does not have a morphological difference between infinitivals and participles, so there are some diagnostic difficulties here. It is true that participles normally require repetition, but that doesn't prove anything here. It could be a place where repetition for some reason is suspended. When you allow interaction between these structures and the passive, you get interesting results in Hindi, Urdu, and in Bangla. In Hindi, Urdu, the Ram and Shyam example, when it is passivized, comes out as "Kal subah Ram aur Shyam daurte hue dekhe gaye," which means yesterday morning Ram and Shyam were seen running. Here, Ram or Shyam is in the nominative and controls agreement on the verb. There is another passivization in Hindi Urdu where the object, which is promoted to subject position, retains the accusative case. In that structure, you get "Kal subah Ram aur Shyam ko," this is the accusative marking, "daurte hue dekha gaya." Ram and Shyam were seen running yesterday morning. In this case, Ram and Shyam don't control plural agreement on the verb because the accusative case prevents the subject from accessing the agreement morphology on the verb. Now, this duality that you find in Hindi Urdu is not found in Bangla because not only for this construction, but much more generally, the Bangla passive always forces the moved object to retain its accusative case marking. So you only get the variant "Kal shokale Ram ar Shyam ke dourote dekha geche." Ram and Shyam accusative were seen running yesterday morning. We are providing these examples so that you get a sense of how the story plays out in Indian languages, even in the context of those constructions where we don't have a definitive analysis that scholars agree upon and that can therefore be presented in an elementary learning material context. However, those of you who speak Indian languages need to look at unresolved problems in order to complete your study of the syntactic material from English. because you cannot really digest the material unless you compare the English data with the Indian language data that you're familiar with. To summarize what we've done in this module, we are looking here at mobile subjects and objects. We spent most of the module on mobile subjects because those are overwhelmingly more frequent than mobile objects. We covered mobile objects in the context of a transformation called tough movement. We covered mobile subjects in relation to raising to subject and raising to object, and also in relation to what is called restricted raising, which we examined in two variants, with naked infinitivals and with participles, the second but not the first lending itself to passivization. We also looked at the interaction between raising processes and their insertion, which is a useful diagnostic for what is happening in the subject area. And finally, we considered some Indian language data that is related to the restricted raising data, and we looked at the ways in which it interacts with passivization in Hindi, Urdu, and in Bangla without arriving at any definitive analysis and without providing definitive process statements because they are not yet available in the scholarly literature. In order to get a clearer sense of the details of our statements and to grasp the formal mechanics, you will need to do the exercises, which involves going to the e-text and reading very carefully what we want you to know before you start on the exercises. In addition, we urge you to continue to read the supplementary material that the recommended reading list encourages you to. If you have any questions or criticisms, please make sure that you do get back to us with them because we're quite anxious to hear from you. Thank you for your attention.